Love does not always leave loudly. Sometimes it leaves a light on, a bed half-made, a house still standing around the damage. Serafina Conti, 23, entered a Sicilian estate as a lawful wife and found herself living beside another woman's memory. She had one plan: be dutiful, be quiet, survive the marriage her family called salvation. She did not know the locked East Wing was still arranged for the girl he had loved first. She did not know the man watching her from behind, that old silence was already losing ground. Lorenzo Vitelli had built Tenuta Vespera into a fortress after grief taught him what softness cost. He understood debt, blood, territory. He did not understand why his new wife stepped toward danger for people who could do nothing for her. Palermo nights are not always bright. Some evenings, the darkness waits inside the gates. And the worst ruin in the world is not fire. It is the moment a man realizes too late which woman made his house a home. The first thing I learned about Tenuta Vespera was that its silence was never innocent. Even on feast nights, when the long courtyard glowed gold with lanterns and the tables bent under silver platters and sugared figs, the silence lived underneath everything. It stayed in the armed stillness of the men posted along the stone walls. It stayed in the pause that rippled through servants when Lorenzo Vitelli entered a room. It stayed in the locked East Wing above us, dark behind tall windows no one opened. I had been Lorenzo's wife for 87 days. That was long enough to know where he liked his coffee placed. Long enough to know he preferred the house quiet after midnight. Long enough to know he did not touch me unless necessity made it unavoidable, and that necessity had not yet been particularly demanding. Smile, Signora. Meyerla adjusted the pearls at my throat with the grave focus of a general preparing a battlefield. Her black dress was severe. Her bun was severe. Even her kindness arrived as if she regretted wasting time on softness. You say that, I murmured, as if it's medicine. It is, she stepped back, for the room. Not for you. That at least was honest. The feast honored the citrus harvest and Lorenzo's latest shipping acquisition, which meant half Palermo's respectable monsters had gathered under our lanterns to eat candied orange peel and discuss violence in the vocabulary of business. My husband stood near the central fountain in a charcoal suit, one hand resting over the back of a chair he had not bothered to sit in. Men angled themselves toward him without seeming to. Women lowered their eyes and then looked again. He was not the most handsome man in the courtyard. Marco Delia, the blonde banker near the lemon trees, had that kind of face. Lorenzo was worse, tall, controlled, dark hair pushed back from a brow built for judgment, a stillness so complete it made other men look clumsy inside their own bodies. When he turned his head, conversation shifted around him like grass bending under weather. He had married me because my father's shipping routes fit his coastline. That was the polite version. The rude version was simpler. My family needed rescue. His empire needed access. I was the contract in silk. Signora, the voice came small and panicked from my left. Matteo, one of the younger stable boys, stood rigid with a wine bottle in one shaking hand and a crimson stain spreading across the front of my pale dress. He could not have been more than 14. His face had gone the color of linen. I'm sorry, he whispered. At the head table, one of Lorenzo's older aunts clicked her tongue in disgust. Somewhere behind me, a woman laughed softly into her glass. Matteo's eyes filled. It's only cloth, I said. He stared as if I had spoken Greek. Then the courtyard gate burst inward with a crack of metal on stone. Not an attack. Worse, in some ways. A horse had broken loose from the outer drive, black-eyed and foaming. The groom dragged half a pace behind before he lost the reins entirely. The animal came into the courtyard wild with fear, iron shoes striking sparks from the stone. Guests lurched back. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. Matteo was directly in its path. He froze. I didn't. It happened before I thought about rank, before I remembered the pearls at my throat, or the wine on my dress, or the fact that this was Lorenzo's world, not mine. The boy was still staring like prey, and all I saw was how young he was. So I stepped toward him. I heard my name, maybe. Or maybe it was just the sound the courtyard made when panic spread through rich people who had never believed danger would arrive before dessert. Matteo dropped the bottle. I reached for his shoulder. A hand closed around my wrist so fast it turned the whole world on its axis. Cold. That was the first intimate thing I ever knew about Lorenzo Vitelli, the cold of his hand. Winter cold. Stone cold. His fingers locked around the inside of my wrist and hauled me back against the hard line of his body just as the horse thundered past where I had been standing. Men moved. Orders cracked through the courtyard in Sicilian. Bruno Rixai launched himself at the dangling reins with a curse and a prayer. The horse reared once, twice, then vanished under the control of 3 men and brute force. The courtyard breathed again. Lorenzo did not let go. "You stepped toward it," he said near my ear. His voice was low. It was never loud. It did not need help frightening anyone. Matteo was alive, crying now, but alive. My own heart was still trying to decide whether to remain in my chest. "Yes," I managed. His grip tightened once. Not pain, emphasis. "It could have killed you. So could the way your aunt was looking at me." That was nerves talking, too much of them. I heard Bruno laugh somewhere across the courtyard, breathless and offended. Lorenzo turned me to face him. Close, he was worse than from a distance. Colder, sharper. His gaze dropped once to the stain on my dress, then to Matteo kneeling and apologizing to 3 different saints at once. "You moved for him," Lorenzo said. I did not understand why that seemed to matter more than the near disaster itself. "He's a child. In this house, that does not answer the question." Before I could ask what it did answer, Matteo scrambled toward me, babbling apology. I touched his shoulder, meaning only to steady him. Lorenzo's eyes followed the gesture, something in his face altered by less than a degree. "Get him water," he told Myrla. Then to me, with that unreadable expression back in place, "Little saint." It did not sound affectionate. It sounded like he had named a problem. The feast recovered because rich families recover from anything if enough people are watching. Music resumed. A new bottle of wine appeared. My husband released my wrist, only when the place his hand had touched felt branded by cold. Later, when the last guests had gone, and the courtyard smelled of extinguished candles and crushed citrus leaves, I walked the upper corridor alone on restless feet. One of the east wing doors stood ajar for the first time since I had come to Vespera. I should not have looked. I did. Moonlight lay across a preserved bedroom, a girl's shawl over a chair. Fresh lilies in water. And on the mantel, a framed photograph of a beautiful dark-haired girl smiling beside a younger Lorenzo in summer clothes, both of them sun-browned and laughing at something beyond the frame. On the back of my neck, I felt the shape of the whole marriage at once. Not a beginning, an interruption. By morning, the horse had become a story and I had become its ornament. At breakfast, one of Lorenzo's cousins called me brave in the same tone people used for decorative martyrs. Another called me reckless. His aunt called me dramatic. No one asked Matteo how close he had come to dying. I sat in the breakfast room beneath a fresco of saints who looked exhausted by human behavior and stirred coffee I did not want. Sunlight angled through tall windows. Beyond them, the citrus terraces stepped down toward Palermo in neat green rows. The sea was a pale blade in the distance. I had grown up in a smaller palazzo with softer carpets and louder affection. Not better affection, just louder. My mother believed problems could be prayed out of existence if the candles were expensive enough. My father believed I was steady, which in his language meant useful. The door opened. Every servant in the room changed shape at once, not visibly, but enough that I noticed. Backs straightened. Sound thinned. Lorenzo entered with Bruno behind him and a folder in his hand. Bruno Rixai was built like a cathedral somebody had taught to wear a suit. Broad shoulders, broken nose, immaculate tie. He carried danger with the weary expression of a man perpetually inconvenienced by other people's stupidity. He also stopped dead at the window. No, Myrla, setting down a tray of apricot pastries, did not look up. It's outside. No, Bruno repeated, pointing at the glass. It's looking at me. A peacock stood on the terrace balustrade with its head tilted, iridescent throat flashing in the morning light. I blinked. You're afraid of peacocks. Bruno gave me a wounded look. Afraid is crude. I mistrust them on moral grounds. They're birds, Myrla said. They're aristocrats with knives in their faces. Lorenzo sat opposite me without comment. Bruno remained several feet from the window, tracking the bird like it had once ruined his life personally. I hated myself a little for laughing. The sound made Lorenzo glance up, briefly, directly, as if he had not yet decided whether amusement suited me. He set the folder beside his plate. You won't leave the inner grounds alone for a few days. I stopped smiling. Good morning to you too. Good morning. It was infuriating that he sounded sincere. I wasn't asking permission yesterday, he said. That is generous of you to clarify, Bruno muttered. She does that with him. Christ, I'd be dead by now. Only because you were born with bad judgment, Myrla said, passing him a plate without letting him take a second pastry. This is rationing. This is care. This is persecution dressed as domesticity. Lorenzo ignored them the way a king ignores weather. The horse did not break loose on its own. My spoon paused against porcelain. You think someone sent it in? I know someone opened the outer latch. Cold moved under my ribs. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms inside mafia houses do, not shocked, simply recalculating. And Matteo? I asked. He was not involved. The answer came too fast to be careless. Lorenzo had already checked. Of course he had. I set down the spoon. Then why am I the one being locked up? His gaze held mine. Because you are the one who stepped into the path. It was a horse, not a bullet. That difference matters less than you think. I should have looked away. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap so he would not see they had gone restless. I am not made of lace, I said. No, his eyes flicked once to my wrist, where faint marks from his fingers had bloomed pale. That is becoming clear. It was such a small sentence, such an unforgivable one. I took a breath that did not help. What exactly are your rules, then? His voice stayed even. No outer grounds alone, no chapel alone, no East Drive after dark. If you want to go into Palermo, you tell Bruno. Bruno, still eyeing the peacock. I object to being used as punishment. You're head of security, Lorenzo said. I'm also a man with needs. Such as carbohydrates and dignity. Myrla removed the pastry basket from his reach. One of those is imaginary. He looked at me with tragic solemnity. You see how I suffer in service. Against my will, warmth tugged at the edge of me. Lorenzo noticed everything. That, more than his temper or his power, was what made him dangerous. He let people believe silence meant absence. It never did. I had plans for the greenhouse, I said. You can have them with staff nearby. That defeats the point. The point, he said quietly, is that you remain alive. The room cooled around the sentence. I looked at him then, really looked. At the scar beside his jaw, I had never asked about. At the hard line of a man who had learned early that control was the cleanest form of mercy. At the wedding band on his hand that looked less like romance and more like a seal on a treaty. Do you always speak like this? I asked. Like what? As if the world has already obeyed you and the rest of us are catching up. Bruno made a choking sound that might have been laughter or a near-death experience. Lorenzo's expression did not change. Often, I hated the answering pulse of my own amusement. Hated more that some part of me had already begun mapping his silences for warmth, the way foolish people look for saints in damp walls. Myrla set fresh coffee beside me. Her hand brushed the table once, not comfort exactly. Recognition. Lorenzo rose before I had finished half the cup. At the door, he looked back just once. Little saint, he said, and this time it was warning, not mockery. My rules are not a request. Then he left, and the room somehow felt smaller for the amount of control still in it. The greenhouse had been beautiful once. You could tell from the bones of it. from the old iron ribs arcing overhead beneath panes fogged by years of neglect. From the cracked marble basin at the center, dry now except for a scatter of dead leaves and one stubborn fern growing where no one had wanted it to. From the scent, damp soil, rust, citrus root, the faint medicinal ghost of crushed rosemary. I stood inside it at noon with a rolled floor plan under one arm and dirt on the knee of my dress. If Lorenzo wanted to put guards on my breathing, he could. I was still going to work. Signora. Tommaso Greco appeared in the doorway with the patient face of a man who had spent 20 years keeping estates from collapsing and people from noticing. He ran Vespera's ledgers, warehouses, tenants, and practical miracles. He also had the kindness of someone who had decided early that power did not excuse sloppiness. I brought the old plans, he said, holding up another tube. And before you ask, yes, the west drainage is failing exactly where you suspected. A flicker of satisfaction moved through me. Thank you, he glanced around the greenhouse. You really mean to bring this back. I dislike a room that has given up. Tommaso's mouth changed almost imperceptibly. That makes two of us. It had been my grandfather who taught me to read foundations the way some girls were taught piano. Cracks, load, water pull, where stone remembers damage even after paint covers it. He restored churches no one wealthy enough to save them actually prayed in. He used to say buildings told the truth faster than people if you knew where to press. So I pressed. I found the warped hinges on the south vent, the hairline fracture in the basin, the section of floor that had sunk half a finger's depth because the old irrigation beneath it had been rerouted badly. By mid-afternoon, my hands smelled of dust and lime. Sweat dampened the back of my neck. I was happier than I had been since the wedding. That was when Lorenzo walked in. He carried outside with him, cold air, cedar, the metallic trace of a man who had stood too long in open shade speaking to armed people. His gaze took in the opened plans, the stacked tiles, my sleeves rolled up, the line of chalk I had drawn over the floor. You ignored me, he said. I adapted you. Tommaso looked abruptly fascinated by a rusted watering can and retreated with the instincts of a survivor. Lorenz stepped over the chalk line and stopped beside the basin. What is this? The original feed line to the citrus house. I knelt and tapped the plan. Someone redirected it years ago to service the east wing first. A pause. I looked up. His face had not changed, but the air had. There was the fast mystery of the east wing again, standing between us like another person. It starved the greenhouse, I said carefully. And the lower terraces. Whoever did it cared about one part of the estate and let the rest decline. I know. That answer should not have unsettled me. It did. I rose too quickly and the room tilted. One of the floor stones shifted under my shoe. My balance went with it. Lorenzo caught me before I hit the basin, one hand at my elbow, one at my waist. Cold. Less cold than before, but still enough that I felt the contrast of his skin through my sleeve and all the places I had not yet been touched by my own husband. Neither of us moved immediately. That was the first real almost. His head bent a fraction, not toward a kiss, not exactly, toward closer, toward something the marriage had not yet learned how to hold without breaking. Then he set me upright and stepped back. You should have had boots, he said. That is a very cowardly sentence. Something like humor crossed his face and disappeared. I'll send for boots. He turned to the plan again, but not before I saw his eyes linger on the chalk dust smudged over my fingers. Why restoration? He asked. No one had asked me that since before the wedding. Because ruined things talk honestly, I said. Because damage leaves patterns. Because if a wall is failing, you can shore it. People are less cooperative. And marriages, I should have lied. Instead, I heard myself answer, those depend on what they were built on. Silence, not empty. Just heavy enough to make my pulse unreliable. He looked toward the east wall of the greenhouse, where sunlight showed every crack. Some foundations are already broken when the doors open. Before I could decide whether that was confession or warning, a phone vibrated in his pocket. He read the screen. The world seemed to lock one notch tighter behind his eyes. He put the phone away too smoothly. "What happened?" I asked. "Nothing for you." That answer had begun to tire me. "You say that as if it changes reality." His gaze returned to me, direct, dark, tired in a way I had not seen before. "Little saint," he said, softer than in the breakfast room, "not every truth wants handling." He left before I could tell him I was already bruised by truths he had never actually named. Lorenzo, the message contained only 6 words. "We found Bianca. Alive. North Road." He read it once, then again as if repetition could make the past less dangerous than a loaded gun. When he lifted his eyes, Serafina stood in the ruined greenhouse with chalk on her hands and a line of sunlight across her throat, looking at fractures the rest of them had learned to walk past. She had stepped toward a stable boy. She had restored life to a room he had abandoned. And for one blinding second, Lorenzo hated the dead for returning now. By evening, the first threat had already crossed his gates. Rain arrived after dusk, hard and slanting, turning the windows black and the stone corridors colder underfoot. I could never sleep when storms took hold of Vespera. The house seemed to listen too closely to its own memories. Doors swelled in their frames. Old hinges complained. Somewhere deep in the west side, one of the peacocks screamed like a woman being murdered, which sent Bruno into a fury so dramatic I heard him through 2 walls. "I refuse," he declared. "I refuse to defend this property against men with rifles and devils with feathers." Myrla's voice, dry as old paper. "It's rain. It's a threat in blue." I smiled despite myself. Then I took my candle and walked where I had promised not to. The east wing corridor smelled different from the rest of the house. Beeswax, lilies, long-shut cloth, the stale sweetness of preservation. My candle shook only once as I reached the half-open door I had seen the night before. Inside, the room was immaculate in the saddest way possible. Not lived in. Kept. The bed turned down. The books dusted. A blue ribbon on the vanity beside a silver-backed brush. On the wall, another photograph of Bianca Morley at 16, laughing into the Sicilian sun with one shoe in her hand. Beautiful, yes, but that was not what hurt. What hurt was the evidence of maintenance, fresh flowers, pressed linen. A room curated like a prayer that refused to admit God had already answered no. She liked storms. Lorenzo's voice from the doorway nearly extinguished the candle in my hand. I turned. He stood in shirt sleeves, no jacket, hair damp at the temples from the weather. Expression stripped down to that terrifying calm he wore when something real had already cut him open, and he was choosing where the blood was allowed to show. "I'm sorry," I said, which was not enough for trespassing through the graveyard of another woman's memory. "No, you are." It was not accusation, just accuracy. I set the candle on the dresser because my fingers had begun to shake. "Who was she?" He came in and closed the door behind him. Thunder rolled above the estate. The room seemed to draw tighter around the sound. "Bianca Morley," he said. "We grew up on adjoining land before my father built the first walls at Vespera." She knew this house before it was safe for silk shoes. His eyes moved once over the room, not lingering anywhere long enough to betray weakness. "She died at 18. I looked at the blue ribbon on the vanity. "And you left her room alive." "She left it that way." It should have been cruel, the honesty of it. It was. It was also more merciful than a lie would have been. "Did you love her?" The question escaped before I could stop it. His jaw shifted. "Yes." There it was, clean, immediate, without apology. Rain struck the windows harder. Somewhere down the corridor, a servant hurried by with soft shoes and no curiosity. I should have gone then. I did not move. "I wondered," I said, "what kind of woman makes a whole wing of a house stop breathing?" His gaze came back to me, and I thought she'd be harder to look at. That almost made him smile. Almost. "She was kind," he said. The answer cut in a place I had not prepared to feel. Not because kindness belonged to Bianca, because I heard how reverently he still carried it. "Then why do the men downstairs speak of her like a legend and not a person?" "Because legends survive safer." Before I could answer, a shout rose from below, then another. Lorenzo was moving before the second one ended. He reached the door in 2 strides. I followed despite myself. The storm had blown open the south stairwell window. Water lashed across the landing. One of the younger maids, Sophia, had slipped on the wet stone and struck her arm against the banister badly enough that blood ran down to her wrist. She was white-faced and trying not to cry. I knelt beside her. "Don't move it!" Lorenzo was already shouting for the doctor. Men appeared at once, summoned by the particular force of his voice when it left silence. "Her forearm's not broken," I said after feeling the angle carefully. "The cut is deeper than it looks." He looked down at me. "You know that how? My grandfather restored churches with half-drained workers and stubborn saints. People fell off ladders often." That was not the whole explanation, but enough of one. I pressed my handkerchief over the wound. Sophia whimpered. Lorenzo crouched on her other side. His hand steadied the girl's shoulder with impossible gentleness for a man built to end conversations with violence. The doctor arrived minutes later. By then, Sophia's breathing had slowed. When the men carried her away, the stairwell emptied, leaving only the storm and the candlelight and the 2 of us standing too close to comfort. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should the dead," I answered. A long pause, then, "Bianca may not be." The words landed so strangely I thought I had misheard them. "What?" His face shut down again at once. Too late. I had seen it, the fracture, brief and dangerous. "Nothing certain," he said. "Lorenz." It was the first time I had used his name without title. The silence that followed knew it. He looked at me as if deciding whether trust was a weapon he could afford. Then he said, "Go to your room." That was the second almost, not a touch this time, but the near thing of being admitted past his armor. He did not let it happen. And still I knew, by the way he stood in Bianca's preserved doorway with rainwater drying on his sleeves, that the house had just shifted under both of us. The old chapel sat on the south rise beyond the lemon terraces, separate from the main house by a gravel path and 2 cypress rows that made it feel more secret than holy. I had loved it from the first week at Vespera, not for God, exactly, though he was welcome there. I loved it because it had not been restored badly yet. Bad restoration offends me more than ruin. That afternoon, the sky hung low and silver. Lorenzo had stationed 2 men within sight of the path after the storm. I pretended not to notice them. Inside the chapel, I knelt near the 3rd pew with a hammer, a chisel, and the old estate plans spread beside me. The floor had been lifting subtly near the apse for days. Water damage, I thought at first. Then I mapped the under supports and found a gap that made no structural sense. Tommaso appeared with a lantern and a troubled expression. "You were right about the hollow," he said. I sat back on my heels. "There's a void beneath," he nodded. "And Signora, someone used it recently." Cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the stone under my knees. Together we pried up the warped slab. Beneath it lay a narrow service shaft, old as the first foundations of Vespera. Dry, hidden, useful. And tucked into the dust near the opening, a cigarette end from a brand no one in the house smoked. Tommaso swore softly. I stared into the dark below and felt the shape of my own secret rise with it. "My father knew about some of these," I said. He glanced at me sharply. "When I was 16, he took me through the lower maps at our palazzo because he liked having a daughter who noticed things. He said every old estate has a second skeleton under it, passages for priests, smugglers, servants, cowards." I swallowed. "I recognized the irregularities at Vespera weeks ago." I just didn't say it. "Why?" "Because shame is not always logical. Because my father's shipping business had not fallen into debt cleanly. Because I had seen strange crates in our warehouses before the marriage and chosen not to understand them too quickly. Because knowing about hidden ways through stone made me feel too close to the kind of family bargain that had put me in Lorenzo's house. Because I didn't know if my family had ever used them, I said, and because if they had, I wasn't sure what that made me. Tommaso looked at me a long moment. It makes you useful now." That should not have felt like mercy. It did. By the time Lorenzo arrived, the slab was fully up and the shaft mapped in charcoal over the plan. He took in the scene once, me on the floor, the lantern, Tommaso grim beside the opening, and came very still. "You kept this from me." Not loud, never loud. But the sentence carried enough weight to lower the temperature in the room. "I only knew in pieces," I said, rising. I was still confirming. "You should have told me at the first piece." "Yes." That answer surprised him, maybe me too. I handed him the cigarette end. "Someone is moving under your estate." His eyes went colder. Tommaso explained what we had found. Lorenzo listened without interruption, then crouched at the opening and looked down into the shaft. His profile under chapel candlelight was harsh enough to frighten saints. "What else do you know?" he asked me. It would have been easier to resent the question. Easier to bristle and protect my pride. Instead, I heard the truth inside it, not accusation alone, but urgency. So I gave him everything. The map irregularities. The starved water line in the greenhouse. The old service tunnel that likely ran beneath the citrus house and up toward the east wing. My father's long-ago lesson about noble houses built on hidden movement. When I finished, the chapel felt stripped. Lorenzo stood. "You should have trusted me." The wound in the sentence went deeper than the anger. "I didn't trust myself," I said. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, some of the steel left his face. Tommaso cleared his throat and retreated toward the door with the survival instincts of a man who valued breathing. Rain began again outside, softly this time, ticking over the chapel roof. I looked down at the slab, at the broken line in the floor. A bad repair tells on itself eventually. Lorenzo's gaze shifted from the opening to my hands, dusty with lime and charcoal. "And people, that depends." My throat tightened around honesty. "Some people build a life over a fracture and pray no weight falls in the wrong place." That was the object lesson of my own marriage, though I had not meant to say it out loud. His hand lifted. Almost touched my cheek. Stopped. That was the third almost and the cruelest yet because I saw the choice happen, saw the wanting, saw him kill it because I mattered more untouched than convenient. From the courtyard below came Bruno's scandalized shout. "Meyerla, if that bird gets into the armory, I am resigning from both love and employment." The interruption was so absurd I laughed once. Helplessly. Lorenzo's hand dropped. Something eased in his mouth at the sound. Only for a second. Then a man appeared at the chapel door, breathless, one of the guards. "Boss!" Lorenzo turned. "We found another one," the guard said. "North wall, same brand." A second cigarette. A second proof. Someone inside Vespera's skin was breathing for the enemy. Lorenzo looked back at me once. The betrayal was no longer suspected. It had begun. The ambush happened in daylight, which somehow felt ruder. Lorenzo had taken me with him to the roadside shrine of Santa Rosalia, because Tommaso insisted the tunnel maps stored in the old votive box might confirm where the lower shaft turned east. We went in 2 cars, Bruno behind us, 3 armed men ahead, the gravel road white under noon sun. I remember dust first. Then the crack, not thunder, gunfire. The front car swerved. A tire burst. Lorenzo's hand hit the back of my seat, so hard it drove me down before my mind caught up with the sound. "Stay down." That voice again, low, controlled, and worse than shouting, because it made obedience feel like the only sane religion left. Glass burst inward. Bruno's men were already firing. The smell of hot metal and cut earth slammed through the car. I curled instinctively, hands over my head. Lorenzo shoved my door open on the far side and half pulled, half carried me into the shallow ditch beyond the road. Dust coated my mouth. Dry grass cut my palms. Somewhere to the left, a man screamed once and stopped. "Can you move?" "Yes." "Good." He was gone before the word settled. I pushed up far enough to see him. Lorenzo crossing open ground with a gun in one hand and absolute intention in every line of his body. Not wild. Never wild. Clear. Ruthlessly clear. 2 men came from behind the shrine wall. He dropped one before the first had finished raising his arm. Bruno took the second and shouted something obscene about his tailoring. Another shot cracked from higher ground. I saw the flash. "Lorenzo!" He turned half a second before the bullet struck the shrine pillar instead of his spine. Stones sprayed. He fired uphill without looking human about it at all. The world narrowed to noise and dust, and the terrible knowledge that the man who shared my table belonged naturally to violence in a way I would never stop feeling. When it ended quickly. That was the worst thing about men like him. They did not make chaos. They ended it. Back at Vespera, I found him in the old armory because he preferred pain in rooms built for harder things. His shirt was off. Blood darkened the line of his side where a bullet had grazed him. Not fatal, deep enough. I carried the basin in with steadier hands than I felt. "You should have let the doctor do that," he said. "The doctor is with Bruno. Bruno has a bruise. Bruno says bruises are how love proves itself." At that, the corner of Lorenzo's mouth moved once. Barely enough to make my breath unreliable, I set the basin down. "Sit," he did. That startled me more than the blood. The room smelled of gun oil, clean linen, and the faint, bitter trace of my own fear. I cleaned the wound carefully. His muscles tightened once under my hand, then went still. "You're not frightened of me," he said. It was not a question. I should have lied. I was frightened of what he was, of what I had seen, of myself for not stepping back from it cleanly. "I'm frightened of many things," I said softly. "Just not of you." His eyes lifted to mine. The silence that followed felt dangerous in a different direction. When I tied off the bandage, his hand closed around my wrist. Cold still, but less. Human at the center. There again was the sensory treachery of him. "Little Saint," he said, and the nickname had shifted somehow. Not warmth yet, but no longer only warning. "Do you know why I noticed you?" My pulse stumbled. "Because I ruined your feast." A strange look crossed his face, almost pain. "At the horse," he said. "You moved for the boy. Matteo." "Yes." His grip loosened, though he did not let go. "He had spilled wine on you. My aunt humiliated you. Half the courtyard would have called it justice if you had let him fend for himself." I could not seem to breathe correctly. "But you stepped toward danger for him anyway," he said. "People in my world don't do that." Not without calculating return. The room narrowed until it held only his hand around my wrist and the truth inside his voice. "I didn't think," I said. "I know." That was the problem, he knew. Lorenzo, he had seen beautiful women, loyal women, clever women, frightened women pretending otherwise. He had seen martyrs too, which were a separate species entirely. But he had never seen anyone step toward danger for someone who had just made her look foolish. Someone powerless enough the room would not have blamed her for letting him be crushed. That was the moment Lorenzo understood now. Not today, not the greenhouse, the courtyard, the stable boy, the instinct. That was when Serafina stopped being his wife in name and became the wound he was trying not to love. When I looked back at him, something in his composure had cracked by exactly one fraction. It was enough. I should have pulled my hand away. Instead, I whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing when you look at me like that." He made a sound low in his throat that might have been restraint tearing. Then he stood, pulled me closer, and kissed me once. Not hard, not long, but with the kind of hunger that frightened me precisely because it was controlled. His mouth left mine before I could stop being innocent in time to understand it. He rested his forehead briefly against mine. Another almost, another refusal. A knock hit the armory door. Tommaso's voice came through, strained. "Boss, they found a woman on the North Road." Lorenzo went still. "Alive," Tommaso added. "She says her name is Bianca Morley." War had arrived wearing a dead girl's face. Bianca Morley looked like grief had been taught to stand upright. That was my first thought when they brought her into the drawing room wrapped in a wool coat too big for her shoulders. Not beautiful, though she was, in the severe way moonlight is. Beautiful, not tragic either. Tragedy suggests dignity. Bianca looked hollowed, kept alive by thin habits and older fear. Her dark hair had been cut bluntly at the jaw. A bruise shadowed one cheek. When she saw Lorenzo, something raw passed through her face so naked I had to look away. He said her name only once. By morning, the East Wing was breathing again. That was the cruelest part. Not that Bianca Morley had returned alive. Not even that Lorenzo had carried her there himself, into the preserved room where her ribbons had waited longer than any prayer had a right to wait. It was that the house knew how to wake for her. Servants moved with the alert quiet of people tending something sacred and dangerous. Fresh linens appeared. Broth simmered. Candles burned low in silver stands that had not been touched since my wedding week. Even the corridor outside her room seemed altered, as if Vespera had been standing on one foot for years and had finally decided to lower the other. I stood at the doorway just after noon with a tray I had not asked to carry. Bianca was propped against the pillows in one of Myrla's nightgowns, the heavy braid of her hair undone across one shoulder. She looked less like a legend awake, smaller, more breakable. The bruise on her cheek had darkened. Her wrists were too thin. Her mouth, without the fever's blur over it, looked made for smiles that had not survived their own history. Lorenz sat beside the bed. Not touching her, not speaking, simply there with that terrible stillness of his sharpened into vigil. Bianca's eyes lifted first to the tray in my hands, then to my face. So this, I thought, was how women met in tragedies men mistook for fate. "I can leave it," I said. Bianca's voice came out rough from disuse. "You are his wife." No title, no bitterness. No wonder, either. Just observation, as if she were naming a wound and checking where it bled. "Yes." Her gaze moved once to the ring on my hand. I wondered what kind of woman would agree to it. Lorenzo stood before I could answer. "Bianca!" The warning in his tone was quiet, protective, instinctive. Something old and ugly shifted under my ribs. "She asked," I said. Let her hear the answer. For the first time since I had known him, Lorenzo looked divided in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with damage. Bianca watched that too. I saw her notice it. I saw the sorrow that came over her face when she did. "I did not mean cruelty," she said softly. "No," I said, "that would require strength." Lorenzo's gaze cut to mine, sharp. Not angry, worse, hurt on behalf of someone else. I set the tray down on the small table by the bed and turned to go. "Serafina!" My name in Bianca's mouth stopped me more than it should have. When I looked back, she had lowered her eyes to the broth. "He kept the room exactly the same," she said. "That was never mercy." Silence moved through the three of us like smoke. Lorenzo went very still. I could have answered 100 ways. I could have lied. I could have offered her saintliness and dignity, and all the polished forms women are trained to wear when men's grief has made a theater of them. Instead, I said, no. It was. Then I left them in the room that had once belonged entirely to memory, and now belonged, more dangerously, to truth. Bruno found me in the lower corridor an hour later, balancing 2 covered dishes and muttering in a tone that suggested war, famine, and domestic persecution had become indistinguishable. "Myrla says 1 tray is for Bianca and 1 is for the doctor," he said. "But the doctor is a fraud and Bianca eats like a sparrow. This is theft by administration." "It's soup," I said. "It's principle." He shifted the trays and lowered his voice. "You look like you want to stab someone with a bread knife. That's comforting. It is meant to be companionable." From the opposite end of the hall, Myrla appeared, immaculate as judgment. "If you drop either tray, Bruno, I will bury you in the herb garden and tell the priest it improved the symmetry." Bruno looked at me with deep suffering. "Do you hear the love in that?" "No," I said. "But I admire your optimism." For 1 treacherous second, he made me smile. Then a footman came up the staircase with a white box wrapped in black ribbon. He bowed to Bruno first, then to me. "For the East Wing, Signora." "No card?" I asked. There was one. He handed it over. The handwriting on the cream paper was elegant, old-fashioned, precise enough to feel like a knife someone had taken time to sharpen. "Welcome home." My fingers tightened. Bruno's expression changed at once. No humor now, no peacocks, no pastry complaints, only danger. "I'll take that," he said quietly. I let him. Above us, somewhere in the east wing, a woman who was supposed to be dead had opened her eyes inside a room prepared for her absence. And the first man to greet her return had not been Lorenzo. It had been Vittorio Sanna. That night, I woke to a cry that did not sound like fear so much as memory being ripped open. By the time I reached the east corridor, Lorenzo was already inside Bianca's room. I stopped at the threshold. She was half upright in bed, gasping, one hand clutching the linen at her chest hard enough to whiten the knuckles. "No," she whispered. "No, don't lock it again." Lorenzo held her shoulders gently, speaking low in Sicilian too fast for me to catch every word. Bianca's eyes flew open. Not on him, on me. Her whole body stiffened. And then she said the one thing in the world that could make the room colder than Lorenzo's hands had ever been. "Vittorio said if I came back," she whispered, "your wife would be the first thing he used against you." I could not stop hearing it, not Bianca's fear. Not even Vittorio's name in her mouth, though that would have been enough to trouble any sensible woman. It was the word used that followed me all morning like a draft under a door. Used against you. As if love were not a wound or a prayer or an error, but leverage. By afternoon, I was in the old laundry house below the southern terraces with Tommaso, a lantern between us and 3 rolled plans under my arm. The place had been abandoned for years. Stone basins lined the walls. Cracked pulleys hung from the rafters. Dust lay thick over everything except, tellingly, the narrow strip of floor near the back cistern. Someone had walked there recently. Tommaso crouched and touched the grit with 2 fingers. Twice in the last day. I looked at the wall behind the cistern, at the hairline seam in the mortar. At the place where old work had been patched too carefully. "There," I said. We dragged the basin aside inch by inch. Behind it, hidden by shadow and bad repair, was a low door banded in iron. Not old iron, new, Tommaso swore under his breath. Madonna! The passage beyond smelled of damp stone, tobacco, and citrus oil. A tunnel, narrow but passable, cut into the foundation bones of Vespera. Old root, fresh use. I held the lantern higher. Marks had been scored into the wall at shoulder height, not words, just slashes, directional and practiced. "Someone-'s been mapping movement," I murmured. "Inside the estate," Tommaso said. Yes, that was the part that mattered. Not outside attack, not gates, not rival men arriving armed and obvious. Someone within the skin of the house had made space for the enemy to breathe. I went 3 paces farther before Lorenzo's voice came down the tunnel behind me like a blade. "Out!" I turned. He stood at the entrance with Bruno beside him and 2 armed men behind that. He had removed his jacket, but not the look in his eyes that said the day had been spent very close to violence and badly. "You followed me," I said. "I corrected your stupidity." Bruno, peering into the tunnel. "To be fair, Signora, this one is dramatic even for you." Tommaso wisely studied the lantern instead of either of us. I stepped back into the wider space. "We found new iron on an old passage. It runs toward the east foundations." "I know where it runs now," Lorenzo said. "Because you were kind enough to test whether it was safe with your own body. Had I waited for permission, the tunnel would still be politely existing." Bruno made a pained noise. "Jesus, Mary, and every administrative saint." Lorenzo took the lantern from my hand. Our fingers brushed, still cold, but no longer stone, only a man under strain. "You don't go first into darkness here," he said quietly. "Why? Because I'm your wife." His gaze held mine. "Because you are mine to keep alive." The words landed harder than they should have. Harder because they were not tender. Harder because part of me wanted them to be. Before I could answer, Bianca's voice came from the doorway. "He used citrus oil when he wanted us to think the rooms were clean." We all turned. She stood wrapped in a gray shawl, pale but steady enough to frighten me more than fever had. Myrla was 1 step behind her, furious in the way only competent women become when sick people disobey them. Bianca looked not at Lorenzo, but at the tunnel mouth. At the house in Cefalu, she said, voice thin but level. Vittorio's men rubbed it on the hinges and the walls. He said fear smelled less if you covered it with something blessed by the land. The room seemed to narrow. Lorenzo crossed to her at once. You should be in bed. Bianca laughed once without humor. And you should have killed him years ago. We are both disappointing medicine. His jaw tightened. I watched her face as she looked at the tunnel. No performance, no manipulative softness. Only recognition so deep the body had memorized it. Did he bring you through passages like this? I asked. Her eyes lifted to mine. Yes. It is a strange thing to have jealousy interrupted by pity. Stranger still when pity survives it. Bianca moved closer to the wall and pointed at the scored marks. Those mean east, chapel, and road. He uses men who obey signs better than speech. Tommaso stared. You're certain? I learned his habits so I could survive them. Lorenz closed his hand over the back of a chair with enough force to whiten the knuckles. If rage had sound, it would have been the silence around him then. I looked at Bianca. Why tell us now? Her answer was immediate. Because he wants this house looking inward while he enters it from below. For a long second nobody spoke. Then Bruno exhaled hard. I preferred the peacocks. Meyerla, arms folded. No, you didn't. You merely understood them. That night, Lorenzo posted men at every lower access point we could identify. He doubled the guard on the east wing. He sent for old maps from Palermo and newer rifles from the north warehouse. And just before midnight, when the house had gone watchful and I stood alone at the greenhouse doors looking out over the dark terraces, he came up behind me. I should have told you sooner, he said. About Bianca, about Vittorio. I kept my eyes on the glass. Would it have changed anything? No, that at least was honest. His hand lifted as if to touch my shoulder. Stopped. When this is over, he said, I will answer every question you ask. I looked at him then. You say that as if surviving a war guarantees surviving what comes after. He did not answer. Which was answer enough. Vittorio arrived at dinner wearing a navy suit and the smile of a man who had spent 40 years teaching wolves to call him father. No one announced him loudly. Men like Vittorio Santa never needed announcing. They arrived, and rooms quietly revised their loyalties. The dining room at Vespera had been dressed for civility. Candles, crystal. Orange branches down the center of the table. The silver polished to a brightness that made everyone look a little haunted. Palermo's evening bells drifted through the open windows and died against stone. Lorenzo stood at the head of the table. I sat to his right. Bianca did not want to come down. I knew that because I had been the one to help fasten her sleeve over the bruise on her wrist when Meyerla's hands were occupied, and Lorenzo's were too dangerous to be gentle with this kind of ruin. Bianca had sat before the mirror in her blue dress and watched me in reflection like a woman trying to decide whether gratitude was an insult. You hate me less than you should, she said. I pinned the pearl at her throat. No, I simply understand that women are rarely the architects of the rooms men trap them in. Her lashes lowered. That's a merciful education. It wasn't mercy that taught it. Now, at table, Vittorio's gaze skimmed over her once and then moved to me. Signora Vitelli, he said, inclining his head. You make the house brighter. It was the sort of compliment old predators gave young wives when they meant I see where the blood will be. How kind, I said. Vittorio smiled wider. Kindness is expensive. I use it sparingly. Bruno, from farther down the table, muttered into his wine, At last, honesty. Meyerla stepped on his shoe under the linen. I knew because his face briefly suggested martyrdom. Dinner progressed with the polished obscenity of powerful people pretending they were not discussing violence over roasted quail. Freight routes. Port inspections. A warehouse dispute in Trapani. 3 men dead, referred to as unfortunate losses in negotiation. And under it all, Vittorio watching. Lorenzo withholding. Bianca going paler by the minute. It was when the oranges were brought out that Vittorio picked one up and turned it once in his hand. In the old days, he said conversationally, we used to hide notes inside the crates. Lovers, smugglers, priests. Amazing what can survive when sealed well. Bianca dropped her fork. The sound cracked the room clean in two. Lorenzo was beside her chair before the fork stopped ringing against the plate. Bianca had gone white down to the lips. Her breathing turned shallow and fast. "Bianca," he said. Vittorio did not move. "Still delicate, I see." That did it. Lorenzo looked up. I had seen him dangerous before, on roads, in ambushes, across plans and rifles and territorial maps. This was different. This was personal enough to make murder look devotional. "If you speak to her again," he said softly, "I will bury what remains of your teeth in my south field." The room stopped. Vittorio set the orange down. "There's the boy I raised." Bianca made a sound I will remember for the rest of my life, small, strangled, ashamed of itself. Lorenzo took her from the room. He did not look at me when he went. That was the humiliation of it, not that he chose her pain. Any decent man would have. It was that he forgot mine would have to sit at the table and continue pouring wine for the wolf who made it. I did not move. I did not let my hand shake when I lifted my glass. Vittorio turned his old, intelligent cruelty fully on me. "You are steadier than most Contis," he said. "I had to be." "Yes," he smiled. "Useful daughters often are." The sentence landed like a slap nobody else in the room was powerful enough to acknowledge. Before I could answer, Bruno leaned back in his chair and said, with the weariness of a man choosing chaos on purpose, "If we are all done threatening the women, perhaps someone can explain why your men smell like chapel mold and cheap cigarettes." Vittorio's gaze flicked to him. Meyerla calmly refilled Bruno's glass as if this were not the conversational equivalent of lighting oil. I loved her a little for it. Lorenzo found me later in the orange room beyond the dining hall, where the night air came through the open arches, smelling of wet leaves and salt from the far sea. "You should not have been left there," he said. "No." He stopped 3 feet away, not close enough for comfort, too close for safety. Bianca panicked. I noticed. His expression tightened. "Serafina, there are ways men ask forgiveness without lowering their pride enough to call it by name." I was learning his fluently. I folded my arms. "What kindness is it you want from me exactly?" He stared. "Patience," I asked. "Silence, grace under spectacle." His mouth hardened. "Understanding," I laughed once, very softly. "That is an ambitious request from a man who still keeps another woman's room as a shrine." He flinched. "Only a fraction. Enough. I did not bring her back to wound you." "No," I said. "Life did that more efficiently." The bells from the chapel carried faintly up the hill. For one terrible, beautiful second, I thought he might cross the distance between us and finally stop treating restraint like virtue. Instead he said, "I won't abandon her twice." And there it was. The cleanest cruelty is often accidental. I looked at him for a long time after that, at the scar beside his jaw, at the exhaustion in his shoulders, at the grief he had mistaken for fidelity for so many years he now wore it like law. When I spoke, my voice surprised even me by how calm it was. "Then don't," I said. "But do not ask me to pretend I cannot feel the shape of where that leaves me." He said my name. I turned before it could become an apology he was too late to deserve. Behind me, in the room full of orange trees in clay pots and moonlight across old tile, Lorenzo stood in the first honest silence our marriage had ever made. And upstairs, the ghost he had loved enough to preserve was breathing again under his roof. Bianca came to my room just after dawn. No maid announced her. No candle preceded her. I only looked up from the half-buttoned cuff of my dress and found her standing in the doorway like a confession that had chosen its own hour. She had color in her face now, which made the damage to it harder to excuse. "I know where he'll go next," she said. No greeting, no softness wasted. I set down the cufflink. "Come in." She did, then closed the door behind her with careful hands. Morning light lay pale over the rug between us. "He won't strike the gates," Bianca said. "That's theater." "He wants Lorenzo turned inward, suspicious, exhausted. Then he'll use the chapel bell passage." I stilled. "The what?" When we were children, there was a narrow servant route from the lower crypt to the bell ladder. Lorenz never knew because his father closed it after the collapse. Vittorio had it reopened. I stared at her. How do you know? Her mouth twisted. Because I was kept beside it for 3 months in a house outside Agrigento, while he decided whether my death or my survival would be more profitable. There are moments when pity stops being abstract and becomes something with teeth. I crossed to the writing table and unrolled the lower estate map. Bianca came beside me, not graceful, not weak, simply present in the same pool of light. Her finger touched one point near the chapel foundation. Here, she said, if the old route still exists, it rises behind the Saint niche. The cracked one, I murmured. Yes, I looked at her then. She met my gaze without defense. Why tell me and not Lorenzo? A long pause. Then Bianca said the truest thing anyone had yet said in that house. Because he still looks at me like he's apologizing to the dead, and I need someone who can see the living. For a second, I could not breathe quite correctly. Then I rolled up the map and went to find Tommaso. By noon, Bruno, Tommaso, 2 armed men, and I were in the back chamber behind the chapel niche, where old lime dust coated everything and the air smelled of wax, earth, and closed time. Bruno held the lantern reluctantly. If a peacock comes out of this wall, I'm defecting. Peacocks do not live in masonry, Meyerla said from the doorway. Bruno gave her a bleak look. You say that with the confidence of a woman who has never been hunted by vanity with feathers. She handed him a wrapped piece of bread and cheese without comment. He took it with the reverence of a sinner receiving absolution. I pretended not to notice the way his shoulders eased when her fingers brushed his hand. Tommaso found the release stone first. The panel shifted. Behind it, the passage rose steep and narrow, just wide enough for a man carrying a rifle sideways. Fresh scrape marks lined the wall. A crate had recently been hauled through. Mother of God, Tommaso whispered. We opened the cache at the passage bend and found ammunition, 2 bottles of lamp oil, a coil of wire, and a folded sheet of paper weighted under a Saint medal. Not a letter, a schedule, mass bell, South Terrace shift, guard rotation. Someone inside Vespera had written it. Bruno's face lost all humor. This wasn't guesswork. No, I said. It was intimacy. Lorenzo arrived 3 minutes later and took in the scene in one sweep. Open passage, crate, schedule, my dusty hands, Bruno armed, Tommaso white with anger. His gaze dropped to the paper, then to me. How? Bianca. Something crossed his face too quickly to name. Guilt likely, shame possibly. Something harder too. The realization that the 2 women his life had built this ruin around had managed in one morning to do what his armed men had not. He took the schedule from my hand and read it. The handwriting, he asked. Tommaso answered grimly. House staff, educated. Likely someone who handles inventories or prayer books. Not Meyerla, Bruno said immediately, like a man ready to defend his religion. Meyerla lifted a brow. How moving. Lorenzo ignored them, but his eyes remained on the schedule. We close every lower route, chapel first, north wall second. Nobody moves alone. Then, quieter to me, you should not have come down here before I saw it. I stared at him. That is what you have to say. It is what I can say without breaking something. Then perhaps break it. The words came out too low for anyone else to hear. He looked at me as if I had struck exactly where armor had already thinned. Before he could answer, Bianca appeared at the chapel door above the passage and spoke into the silence with frightening calm. If you want to kill Vittorio, she said, stop treating me like proof of the past and start treating me like a witness. No one moved. Lorenzo turned slowly. Bianca stood there in gray, one hand braced on the stone, pale but unflinching. The wind from the open chapel door lifted a strand of her hair. For the first time since her return, he looked at her not like a relic, not like a debt, not like a girl dragged out of his unfinished grief. He looked at her like a woman who had survived a war he had not seen. It changed the room, but not enough. Because that night, when the guards were shifted and the lower routes sealed, and the house finally exhaled one exhausted breath, Bianca vanished from the east wing. On her bed, they found the blue ribbon from years ago, and beside it, one sheet torn from my map roll. The morning Bianca disappeared began in the kitchen. That, more than anything, felt like mockery. Not in the chapel with its cracked saints, not in the east wing with its preserved grief, not in one of the tunnels where betrayal had taught the estate to speak in secret. In the kitchen, where bread rose, coffee darkened the air, and Mateo tried very hard not to be 14 in front of important adults. Myrla had decided that tension made everyone stupid, and therefore useful labor would restore civilization. So she put me to work sorting figs for preserves and put Bruno on wood duty, which he received like a personal insult to his station. "I head security," he informed the room, hauling in a crate. "I do not court splinters. You head appetite," Myrla said. "This is character development. There has been too much of that in my life." Mateo, red-eared and solemn, reached for the copper syrup pan at the same moment. One of the younger footmen swung the wood crate too wide. The edge struck the shelf. Glass jars shuddered. A heavy iron hook, badly set for years in the old plaster, tore loose overhead. It happened in one breath. The sound, Mateo looking up. The hook and hanging rack starting down. I moved before thought. Again. Always, it seemed, before dignity and self-preservation could hold a proper debate. "Mateo!" A hand closed at the small of my back and hauled me sideways so sharply the floor tilted. Warm. That was the first thing I knew, not his strength. Not the crash of the rack where I had been standing half a second earlier. Not Myrla's curse or Bruno's bellow or Mateo's white face. Warm. Lorenzo's hand spread against the small of my back, steady and hard and startlingly human through the linen of my dress. For one suspended second, the whole kitchen held. The broken rack lay across the stones. Jars had shattered. Honey and glass spread in bright ruin. Mateo was unhurt, flattened against the prep table with eyes enormous in his face. Lorenzo did not remove his hand. "You did it again," he said. His voice was very low. I looked up at him. There was flour on one sleeve of his black shirt. Morning light caught the dark stubble at his jaw. Sleep had not touched him kindly. Neither had Bianca's disappearance, which had hollowed something behind his eyes and sharpened everything else. "Apparently," I said, because my pulse had become useless. Mateo started apologizing to every saint in Sicily. Bruno pointed at the fallen hook. "I have been saying for months this kitchen is a tactical hazard." "No," Myrla said. "You've been saying the biscuit tins are too high. They are also too high." Lorenzo's gaze had not left mine. In Chapter 1, his hand at my wrist had felt like capture. A warning. A man stopping an inconvenience from becoming a corpse. Now, with his palm warm through the linen at the base of my spine, it felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. Home. The realization crossed his face before he could stop it. Small, terrible. Complete. I saw the exact moment he understood that whatever part of him had once belonged to memory had grown roots somewhere living instead. "Little saint," he said, and this time it was neither mockery nor warning nor restraint. It was almost reverence. My throat tightened around nothing. Then Tommaso appeared in the doorway, gray-faced and breathless. The room broke. "We found the East Guard," he said, "dead in the lower orchard." Lorenzo's hand left me. The loss of its warmth felt absurdly like grief. Tommaso looked between us only once before continuing. "And Bianca left a note." No one spoke. "To you?" Lorenzo asked. Tommaso hesitated. "No," he said, "to Signora Vitelli." Everything in me went still. He handed me the folded paper. The handwriting was Bianca's. I knew that now from the map notes she had made the day before. "I am sorry. He will use me until one of us is dead. He cannot do it from inside your walls anymore. Tell Lorenzo the Bell Passage was only the first wound. Tell him Vittorio keeps ledgers at the old salt house. And tell him this, if he still remembers how to hear it. The dead girl he loved was easier than the woman who survived." Below it, one final line. "Forgive me for leaving you the grief. I read it once. Then again." Lorenzo held out his hand. I gave him the note. He read in silence. The kitchen waited. Finally, he looked up. "Did you know?" It was not shouted. That made it worse. Bruno actually closed his eyes. I stared at my husband as if I had mislearned his face. "Did I know she would run into the mouth of the man who kept her caged?" I asked. His jaw flexed. "Did you help her? There are wounds that arrive with blood and noise. And then there are the clean ones, the ones that slip between the ribs without raising their voice." Myrla said very quietly, "Boss." He heard her, ignored her. I felt the whole house then. The kitchen, the greenhouse, the breakfast room, the chapel floor I had opened for him, the tunnels, the east wing. Every room where I had tried, with my foolish, useful hands, to make something honest inside a structure built on bargains and ghosts. "You really are your house," I said. His face changed. Too late. "Serafina, no." My voice did not shake. "You do not get to speak until you understand what you asked." I untied my apron and laid it on the table beside the broken figs. Bruno looked stricken. Myrla looked murderous on my behalf. Matteo had gone perfectly still, as children do when adults begin breaking in the ways that last. Lorenzo took one step toward me. "Don't," I said. He stopped. "That hurt him, good. I stepped into danger for your people," I said. "I found the fractures in your walls. I gave you every truth I had. I stood in rooms built to humiliate me, and remained kind to a woman your grief turned into a shrine. And when she fled the cage, you all helped build around her. Your first instinct was to ask if I had betrayed you." His silence confessed worse than any defense could have. I smiled then, though there was nothing warm in it. "My father always said I was the steady daughter," I murmured. "Useful enough to survive anything." I looked once around the kitchen, at the broken jars, the scattered honey, the sunlight across the tiles. The people who had accidentally become dearer to me than safety ever had. Then I met Lorenzo's eyes. But I was not put on this earth to survive unloved in a beautiful house. When I walked out, no one tried to stop me except Lorenzo. He followed me as far as the front corridor. "Serafina!" My name in his mouth sounded unlike any title he had ever owned. I turned at the foot of the stairs. For the first time since our wedding, he looked not controlled, not terrifying, not inevitable, only afraid. If he had looked like that sooner, I might have been lost. Instead, I said, "Take your men to the salt house. Kill the right ghost this time." Then I went upstairs, packed one bag, and left Tenuta Vespera before noon. No fanfare, no carriage parade. No dramatic witness except Bruno standing in the courtyard, as if someone had shot him in a place medicine could not fix, and Myrla beside the gate with both hands folded too tightly to be calm. Matteo cried. I kissed his brow and told him to watch the horses before he tried to save them. Then I stepped into the car Tommaso had quietly arranged. As the gates opened, I looked back only once. The estate stood exactly as it had stood the day I arrived. Stone, terraces, locked histories, armed men at measured distances. But it was different now, not emptier. Worse, a house can survive fire. What it cannot survive, not really, is the moment warmth leaves it on purpose. And behind me, in the courtyard of Tenuta Vespera, Lorenzo Vitelli finally learned what it meant for a wife to walk away only once.